Our passage today is in Leviticus chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Tell the Israelites, when a woman becomes pregnant and gives birth to a male child, she will be unclean for 7 days, as she is during the days of her menstrual impurity. The flesh of his foreskin must be circumcised, and on the 8th day she will continue in purification from her bleeding for 33 days. She must not touch any holy thing or go into the sanctuary until completing her days of purification. But if she gives birth to a female child, she will be unclean for 2 weeks, as she is during her menstrual impurity. She will continue in purification from her bleeding for 66 days. When her days of purification are complete, whether for a son or daughter, she is to bring to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting a year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. He will present them before the Lord and make atonement on her behalf. She will be clean from her discharge of blood. This is the law for a woman giving birth, whether to a male or female. But if she doesn't have sufficient means for a sheep, she may take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. Then the priest will make atonement on her behalf, and she will be clean."
Thanks, Nick. That's a great scripture reading, isn't it? It's great to be with you today. I'm Brian. I'm one of the pastors here at GBC, and we are continuing a series we've been in. First portion of the scripture is called the Old Testament. There's a writing that we know as Leviticus, and as you can tell, we are just in the depths of the strange and weird and even maybe cringy portion of Leviticus. There's more cringy stuff. We're just going to wait till next summer. So we're just going to deal with what's cringy today. We're going to be looking at Leviticus 12 through 15. We're going to look at all 4 of those chapters today because they're one unit that talk about how to become unclean and then how to be made clean again. And before we talk about that, what I want to do is I want to make you aware of something that I hope will make us be able to read these verses a little more sympathetically. I want to make you aware of the fact that in every human culture that has ever existed, including ours, there are taboos and rituals when it comes to cleanliness that don't quite make sense when you try to explain them. Prime example. Most of us, I hope all of us, but most of us probably wouldn't be willing to eat a sandwich while we're sitting on the toilet. That's right. We're just going to be awkward from the gate today. It's going to be an awkward morning, so let's just dive into it, right? Most of us, I hope all of us, but most of us aren't going to be comfortable eating a sandwich while we're sitting on the toilet. Why? It's not morally wrong to eat a sandwich while sitting on the toilet. Your hands aren't touching anything. In fact, if you're like me, you will scroll through your phone while you're sitting on the toilet and then put that thing on your face later when you make a phone call. But you won't eat a sandwich when you're sitting. In fact, have you ever thought about your toothbrush? We brush our teeth in the bathroom, and then you leave, if you're like me, you leave your toothbrush on the counter and then flush the toilet with the toilet seat up, and you can't tell me that whatever you just deposited in that toilet isn't floating up in water particles onto your toothbrush. It is. Yeah, see, it is. I just ruined toothbrushing for some of you, but here's some good news. As you're waiting for the quarterly update to start, you can hop on Amazon, and they have these little plastic caps that you can buy for your toothbrush that can protect it from fecal matter. I did. I'm sorry. Okay. There are taboos and rituals around cleanliness in every culture that are difficult to explain why when we dive into them at times. Because the bathroom, think about it, the bathroom is an unclean space, and we even have washing rituals that we go through in order to come out of that unclean space feeling clean again. So I'm just hoping by acknowledging that, it'll help us to read these texts a little bit more sympathetically. I'm hoping that we'll also remember that despite some of the discomfort that exists in these texts, we saw it last week, we've continued to see it all summer long, that even these ancient, weird laws have something to teach us about following after Jesus in our lives today. And so what I've tried to do, like parents, if you've got 2nd through 5th graders in here right now and you're freaking out a little bit, I've done the best that I can to make sure you're not going to have an awkward conversation as you drive home. If you have to have an awkward conversation, come talk to me later. I'll make it up to you somehow. If you need help processing how things like what we just read in Leviticus 12 are actually in the scriptures, I'd love to help you. In other words, what I want you to hear me saying right now is that if I can help you out at all after today, I'm here. And I would love to talk with you. And what I want to do is I want to look at Leviticus 12 through 15 under 3 headings. Let's look at what these laws mean, what they teach, and who they foreshadow. Let's look at these laws and let's discover what they mean, what they were all about, what they teach us today as modern readers, and who they foreshadow. Now, in order to do that, I just want to remind you about some categories we discovered last week, where we talked about the fact that in the ancient Israel mind, there were 2 categories or buckets into which you would put things in creation. There was the bucket of holy, and in that bucket was the Lord and the Lord alone. Like Yahweh himself is the only holy one. He belongs in a category. And then the other category was common, and that's where everything else in existence belonged. To be common wasn't a bad thing. In fact, good and beautiful things could be common. It just meant that you weren't holy. But the beautiful picture of the Bible is that God does not view His holiness as something to hold to himself, but he actually wants to share it with his creation. And so he's made it possible for things in that common category to move into the holiness category with him, including human beings. Like, it doesn't take long when you're reading the Old Testament to realize that God has created us as human beings to be holy as he is holy. So we talked about that last week. We have these categories of holy and common, and then within common, there were 2 states of being or ways of existence, and those 2 things are clean and unclean. If you were common in creation, you would exist in a state of either being clean or unclean. And what it meant, you could really think about this, it's analogous to what we think about when we think of sickness and health, so much so that when the scriptures talk about unclean and clean, they will talk about it metaphorically as sickness and health. And so here's what these 2 states of being mean. To exist in a state of being that is clean means that you are existing as a human being in an ideal state. It means that you're whole, that everything is going well within your body, that your life is going well, and that you haven't encountered anything that might bring that under threat. To be unclean, this is going to be self-explanatory, but it's the best I've got. To be unclean means that you are existing in a less than ideal state. It means that something's off. Something's wrong with your body. To become unclean was when you came in contact with some kind of force or stuff or even just an experience that would threaten living in that clean or ideal state. And so these are the categories that we have. You have common and you have holy, and then if you're common, you are either clean at all times or you are unclean. And there's forces that can make you unclean, and we see what some of those are. So Leviticus chapter 12 tells us that a woman going through childbirth makes her and the child unclean. And then in Leviticus 13, we read about how skin disease makes you unclean, where if you were an ancient Israelite and you had a scab or a mark or a boil, you would have to go to the priest to have the priest examine it. And here's what we read in Leviticus chapter 13, verse 3. It says, "The priest will examine the sore on the skin of his body. If the hair in the sore has turned white and the sore appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is in fact a serious skin disease. After the priest examines him, he must pronounce him unclean." So if you were an Israelite and you had some kind of blemish on your skin, you would go to the priest and he would examine it. And at the very least, you would have to quarantine for 7 days to make sure that whatever it was didn't spread. But if it was bad enough or it began to spread, you would be determined unclean by the priest and you would have to leave the camp. So that makes you unclean, skin diseases. And then in Leviticus 15, it's all about how reproductive fluids make you unclean. So if a man has a nocturnal emission, he is unclean. When a woman goes through her monthly menstruation, she is unclean. In fact, if a husband and a wife in Leviticus 15 have sex, they are unclean until evening. So these are all of the things that make you unclean in Leviticus 12 through 15. Childbirth, skin disease, reproductive fluids. I'd get more explicit with that list, but like I said, I'm trying to spare you an awkward conversation later on, maybe even with your own spouse. And so, but these are the things that make you unclean. And immediately, what does your brain do? Why? What's up with this stuff? Why do these things make you unclean? And I think it has to do with what these laws mean, with what's at the very heart and core of them. And in order to talk about that, I just want to remind you what these things don't mean, what they're not about. These laws are not primarily about hygiene or sin. Now you can see some of these laws would be about hygiene. You don't want someone living in the camp that might have a really contagious skin disease, right? But hygiene doesn't explain all of these laws. And then on top of that, you've got to remember that to become unclean is not sinful. It's not wrong to give birth to a baby. In fact, it's good and beautiful. There's another portion of Leviticus 12 through 15 that tells us if you touched a dead body, you became unclean. But it's a good thing for you if you bury a dead loved one who just passed away. And on top of that, when you read through Leviticus 12 through 15 really carefully, you'll notice that there are no commands about avoiding becoming unclean in these ways, because it's unavoidable. These are things that are outside of control. They're just going to happen to you. And so these things are not about sin, but notice they are serious. If you have a skin disease, you would have to live outside of the camp. If you read in Leviticus 13, it's not just skin disease, it's also if mildew shows up on your clothes. You only had 2 to 3 garments max as an ancient Israelite, and if one of those garments got mildew on it, you would have to destroy it. If your house had mold in it, your house became unclean, and you would have to tear down your house and build a new one. And so uncleanness isn't about wrong, but it's also serious. And so what's at the heart of these laws, what they mean is that they're showing us just how holy God is. Remember that category that he's in all by himself. He's holy. Well, that's because while uncleanness isn't sinful, to approach God in an unclean state is. Because if you approach God or his stuff in an unclean state, you're disrespecting him. You're being dismissive of the holiness of God. And so it could actually be dangerous for you to enter into God's presence in an unclean state. What these laws mean is that they're a reminder of just how holy our God is. How set apart he is, that he is so holy and set apart that any inkling of impurity or uncleanness gets consumed in his presence. And that teaches us some really cool things, I think. There are 3 things these laws teach us that I want to show you in each of these sets of chapters, one from chapter 12, one from chapters 13 and 14, and one from chapter 15. Let's start with Leviticus 12. I want to address something that I'm probably not going to address this in a satisfactory way, but I can't just ignore it, and that is this. How many of you noticed while Nick was reading that the amount of time a woman is unclean was longer when she gave birth to a baby girl than when she gave birth to a baby boy? How many of you noticed that? Cringy, right? Especially for us as Westerners. And so what that does is it's made a lot of us as Westerners assume that the reason a woman is unclean for longer when giving birth to a baby girl is because of patriarchy. This is the scriptures showing us that men are more valuable than women, that baby girls are dirtier than baby boys are, and that's just not the case. Every commentary I read, conservative, liberal, every commentary I read said that to assume this is some kind of patriarchal statement is to read Western categories into biblical ones. In fact, if you want to know what God thinks about the value of men and women, you got to remember that Leviticus happens in a context. Like Leviticus is part of a collection of writings in the scriptures that we call the Pentateuch. You might also hear it called the Torah. It's the first 5 writings of the scriptures, or the law. It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And right out the gate, in Genesis chapter 1, first writing of the Old Testament, you find out what God thinks about the value of men and women in Genesis 1:27, when it says, "So God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them, male and female." The founding statement of the scriptures when it comes to men and women is that we are equal in value, dignity, and worth because we are created as the image of God. And so right away, right out the gate in the scriptures, you're not allowed to devalue women because according to God's own word, we are all equal in value, dignity, and worth because we are all made as the image of God. And on top of that, what's really interesting is Leviticus 12 doesn't tell us why A woman is unclean for longer when giving birth to a girl than she does to a boy. And so any suggestion that we make as to why that might be the case is just that. It's just a guess. But our guesses have to be in line with the categories that the Scriptures have already given us. And so a guess that says this is about patriarchy just isn't valid. It doesn't work. But everything else that I could give you for why this is the case is just that. It's just a guess. Like, the simple fact of the matter is we don't know why that law existed. That's the unsatisfactory part. But what do they teach us? What do these laws teach us? What does this law, particularly Leviticus 12, teach us? I think in order to understand that, you've got to understand something really important about childbirth. In the ancient world, the number one cause of death for women was childbirth. Not famine, sickness, or war. The number one cause of death for women in the ancient world was childbirth. We are shielded from that in our modern Western world because of the advances of medicine. But if you really think about it, when a woman and a child come through childbirth healthy and alive, that's a miracle. Even with all of the advances we've made in medicine in our world. So think about how it was in the ancient world. When you gave birth in the ancient world, the mother and the child were brought to death's doorstep. They were having a brush with death itself. And so all of the fluids that are involved in childbirth render both the mother and the child and also the midwife assisting in the birth unclean because they've drawn near to death. Think about skin disease. What is skin disease? It is death on your skin. Like, it's dying skin cells on display for everyone to see. Even Leviticus 15 with all the reproductive fluid stuff, listen to me, ancient people weren't barbaric and they weren't cavemen or women. They knew where babies came from. And so in the ancient mind, when these fluids mixed together, that's when a baby was conceived, and that's when a baby was going to come around. And so when these reproductive fluids that are supposed to mix inside of humans to make babies are coming outside, it's a sign of death. It's a sign of decay. You're leaking life fluid that's not supposed to be outside of the body. In other words, uncleanness happens when you encounter or interact with something that's associated with death. Uncleanness happens when you come in contact with something connected to or related to death. These clean and unclean laws in these chapters are meant to teach us that this world is not how Yahweh meant it to be. This world is full of death. It's full of disorder and decay. And so anytime you had a brush with death, even in a good thing of bringing a child into the world, skin disease or leaking reproductive fluids, it was a reminder that our world is filled with death and decay. And that reminds us of two things. The first thing it reminds us of is that you and I are fragile. We are in a world full of death and decay and disorder, and we are not immune to it. But it also reminds us that God hates that. That even the hint, the slightest sniff of death cannot come into God's presence because He will do something about it. Like this is the reminder that God's original intent for the world was to have no death, no disorder, no decay at all. And one day, He's going to do something about it. He's going to come back and destroy all of the death, disorder, and decay that makes His world unclean. And so Leviticus 12 gives us a humbling and encouraging lesson. It reminds us that we live in a world full of death and decay and that we are fragile because we are subject to that. But it also reminds us that God is going to do something someday about all of that death and decay when His life-giving presence floods the earth as the waters cover the sea. So that's the first thing this passage teaches us. The second thing this passage teaches us is that there's always hope. This is one of the things I love about following Jesus so much. It does not matter how bleak, dark, or lost any situation looks, there is always hope. Leviticus 13, if you are diagnosed with a defiling skin disease, you are made unclean and you are pushed out of the camp. Here's what that meant. You had to pack up all your stuff and move outside, away from your family, away from your friends, and most importantly, away from the worship of Yahweh, and live outside of the camp. But there was hope. There was hope of restoration. Just read with me, Leviticus chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. The Lord spoke to Moses, "This is the law concerning the person afflicted with a skin disease on the day of his cleansing. He is to be brought to the priest, who will go outside the camp and examine him. If the skin disease has disappeared from the afflicted person, the priest will order that 2 live, clean birds, cedar wood and scarlet yarn and hyssop be brought for the one who is to be cleansed." I love this. Where does the priest go in order to cleanse the impure person? Outside of the camp. This is crazy because everything that the priest does is done inside the camp where God dwells in the tabernacle, but not here. He goes outside to examine the person that has been made unclean by a skin disease to see if the skin disease has resolved. And if it's resolved, you keep reading, he does a ritual that cleanses the person. And they're brought back into their community where they quarantine for 7 days to make sure that the skin disease is really gone. And then at the end of 7 days, the priest brings the person to the tabernacle before the Lord and sacrifices a lamb. And here's what we're told in verse 14. The priest is to take some of the blood from the guilt offering and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. We've read about that ritual before. Do you remember where? When did this ritual take place? Ordination of the priests. If you were made unclean by a skin disease, you got the most severe consequence that came for being unclean. You were put out of the camp. When you were brought back into the camp, back into community, back into the presence of the Lord, you were given the same ritual as the priests. The only people who ever had lamb's blood dabbed on their right earlobe, their right thumb, and their right big toe were priests and people being fully restored back into their priestly identity as part of God's people. Like, do you see this? This is beautiful stuff. You realize what this means, right? There is always hope for cleansing. It does not matter what happens in your life. It does not matter what dirty thing you do or what evil thing is done to you. Yahweh can cleanse it. He can take care of any impurity that enters into your life at any time. But only Yahweh can do it. Like, this is what's amazing and humbling about this text at the same time. What this is teaching us, track with me, is that if you want to make yourself able to approach God, you don't just have to be good enough, you have to be clean enough. Can I say that one more time? If you want to make it possible for you to approach God, you have to not just be good enough, you have to be clean enough. Most of us settle for good enough, don't we? Like, I'm convinced that all of us, whether you call yourself a Christian or not, will fall into a mindset at some point in our lives that I have to make myself good enough for God. I've got to do good stuff in order to make God happy, because if I'll do that, then He'll bless me, He'll make my life great, He'll love me, He'll accept me, and if I don't do that, then I'm not going to get any of that stuff. Listen, that is a lie straight from the pits of hell. And one of the reasons it's a lie is because it sets the bar too low. You don't just have to be good enough in order to approach God. You have to be clean. And I'm convinced that there's nothing we can do to make ourselves good enough in the first place, let alone make ourselves clean enough. But Yahweh has made a way. There's a way for all of our sin and all of our impurities to be cleansed and live in His presence. But there's a problem, isn't there? Because even if you ask me to, I am not going to sacrifice a lamb and dab its blood on your right earlobe, your right thumb, and your right big toe. Just not, like, I love you as your pastor. I'm willing to do lots of things for you. That's not one of them. So, how are we cleansed then? How do we find the cleansing we so desperately need? Through the one whom these verses foreshadow. The same complete and utter cleansing available to the ancient Israelite is available to you and I through Jesus. Can I show you that? See, we have 4 accounts of Jesus' life in the second portion of the scriptures called the New Testament. And one thing I would suggest you do is get together with some friends or even just by yourself and sit down and read the account of Jesus' life that we know as Luke. Just read it out loud. Get together with some friends on a Friday night and do it. Or just in your own, I don't care what you, just read it out loud. And what you'll notice is that in Luke's healing narratives, he has intentionally put in Jesus' path people who would have been in the list of unclean in Leviticus 11 through 15. And Jesus touches every single one of them. He touches dead bodies. He touches people with skin disease. He touches people who would have eaten non-kosher foods. One of the greatest examples of this is in Luke chapter 8, where we're introduced to a woman who we're told in verse 43 was suffering from bleeding for 12 years, who had spent all she had on doctors and yet could not be healed by any. It's very likely that the bleeding she's having here is the same kind that's talked about in Leviticus 15, only hers is constant. So she's not just unclean once a month, she's unclean all the time, constantly cut off from community and the worship of Yahweh for 12 years. And notice that she's done everything she humanly can to make herself clean, and none of it's worked. She's out of options. She has no hope other than Jesus. And so what she does is she gets as close as she can to Jesus and she just touches his robe. And here's what it says in verse 42. It says she approached from behind, touched the end of his robe. Instantly her bleeding stopped. According to Leviticus, what should have happened to Jesus? Jesus should have been made unclean. Because if you read Leviticus 15, you'll find out that uncleanness is like a contagion. It spreads like a disease. In fact, you're told in Leviticus 15 that if a person has some kind of bodily emission of reproductive fluid and they are unclean and they sit on a chair, that chair becomes unclean. And if nobody cleanses that chair and somebody who's clean sits on the unclean chair, they become unclean. Like, uncleanness was a contagion that could spread like wildfire if it wasn't dealt with. And so when this woman touches Jesus, he should be made unclean. Because any Israelite who's in a clean state that is touched by something unclean should be made unclean. And yet she's healed. How? Well, because earlier in Luke, there's this moment where a demon, of all things, tells us that Jesus is the Holy One of God. You want to know what else is contagious besides uncleanness in the Old Testament? Holiness. When you come in contact with something, like say you eat some holy food in the Old Testament, the holiness is transferred to you. And so when Jesus is touched by this woman and she's healed, it's showing us that he's the Holy One of God, come to spread God's holiness and purity in the world. And you want to know what's even more insane? The unclean woman touches Jesus and she's not consumed. Remember, what is sinful is for someone who's unclean to interact with the holy. It's dangerous because God's holiness will burn up any impurity, any uncleanness. You're taking your life into your own hands. And yet, this woman touches Jesus, and he's not made unclean, she's made clean. She touches Jesus, and she's not consumed, she's healed. What in the world is going on? Well, Jesus tells us later in Luke 8, where Jesus realizes that someone's touched him because healing power has gone out. That's a huge mystery that we could talk about for hours. And so Jesus is like, who touched me? There's all kinds of stuff happening. Fast forward. Jesus finds out it's this woman, finds out her situation, and he looks at her, and he doesn't condemn her, he doesn't rebuke her. Instead, he says in verse 48, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace." This is it. The woman is healed because she believes that Jesus can take her impurity on himself and give her his purity, give her his holiness. And so the same cleansing then is available to you and I that woman experienced that day through the same means, faith in Jesus. And just like the priest goes out of the camp in Leviticus 14 to get the unclean person and bring them back into community, Hebrews chapter 13, verses 12 and 13 tells us, therefore, Jesus also suffered outside the gate so that he might sanctify the people by his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing his disgrace. Jesus is the one who went outside of the camp so that you and I could be cleansed. He went out of the camp. He went outside of the city, took all of our impurity on himself, and died on our behalf so that we could conquer sin and death by putting all of our trust, all of our hope, and all of our faith into him. In the Old Testament, people came looking for priests when they were already healed to be made clean. In the New Testament, people come to Jesus so they can find healing in the first place. He's a priest unlike anyone we've seen before. Jesus came to destroy all that defiles and leave in its place cleansing and wholeness. We only need look to him to find it. Have you done that, friend? Have you come to Jesus to find his cleansing? Have you placed your faith in him by putting all of your hope, all of your trust, all of your chips in on Jesus? Because hear me really clearly, that's the only way you're going to find the cleansing you so desperately need. And that's true for you if you have placed your faith in Jesus. Because if you have, can I ask you, is there an area of your life that you need to let his cleansing power into? Because I don't know if you've noticed, but our world has a way of making us feel really unclean, doesn't it? Making us feel really dirty. Maybe you had parents who told you were worthless and you would never amount to anything. Maybe you had someone you really love completely cut you off. Maybe you were even abused. And that stuff, it just sticks with you, doesn't it? It's like a stain that you can't get rid of, that you can't make clean. But we try, don't we? We work really, really hard to prove our parents wrong and show that we are worth something and we will amount to something. We do everything we can to get back in that person's good graces. We try all that we can find to be rid of the memories of the abuse that we faced. And it doesn't work. All the self-help in the world can't help us find the cleansing we so desperately need. And that's the teaching of these laws. We need something outside of ourselves to give us the cleansing that's required in our lives. Jesus' ministry was all about reaching out to the impure, the rejected, the marginalized, and bringing transformation into their lives that equipped them to live in his kingdom forever. And so let the cleansing power of Jesus' life come, Jesus' love and power come into your life by taking your identity from him and not what anyone else says. Let Jesus cleanse you by being willing to listen to the words that he has to say about you over and above the words of anyone else. Let his cleansing come into your life so that you can experience all of the love and the acceptance and the mercy and the purpose that you need that's been robbed from you. Jesus came into this world to destroy everything that defiles and leave in its place wholeness and cleansing. You only need to look to him to find it. Let's pray. God, thank you for these laws that even in their strangeness to us and downright cringiness at times, they still reveal who you are. They reveal your kindness to us, your mercy to us, the love that you have for us. And so I pray that we would respond. I pray for anyone listening to this that hasn't found cleansing in you yet. Holy Spirit, would you draw them to yourself now? Would you make today the day that they step into the new life that is temporarily free from death and decay through the certainty of being absolutely free from it in the next? Would you bring them out from outside the camp into your community as your child, Father? Would you bring them the cleansing that they so desperately need so they can live free from all the dirt and the filth that exists in this world? I pray the same for my brothers and sisters. Each and every one of us are struggling with things on some kind of level, some things that we're aware of, some things that we ignore and just hope will go away. May we recognize today, Jesus, that the only way we can be washed clean, to be rid of that stain, is through you and your power and your love. Would you help us to turn to you in every area of our lives? And then would you encourage us to share that with others so that they can find the same cleansing that they need? Jesus, we confess to you today that you have come to destroy everything in this world that makes it not what you intended it to be, and to replace it with all that you intended. And we praise you for the fact that you have given us a chance to be a part of that world and to come into it through belief in you. May we do that on a new level today than we ever have before. It's in your name we pray. Amen.